So this is a lecture for the last part of chapter 34. Now, this is one of my favorite lectures. I would have hated to have missed this one, but I'm going to tell you a lot of stuff that's not in the book and ultimately is not going to be on the AP exam. But when you go to college, you're going to be expected to know this stuff if you're going to be either an econ or a business major. And it's a lot of stuff. This is just a review of US history, actually. So let's get to it because this could be a very, very long video. So let's get to it. So what I've got on the board here is an outline of banking history of the United States. And it starts off with the colonial era up here, an era before 1776 and through the Revolutionary War. So up until about the 1780s, 1789 or so. There were very few banks. They were all based on the British style of banking. They were mostly for merchants, and I mean big merchants, the people that did international trade for the most part, wealthy merchants, and very wealthy landowners. They're the ones that utilized the banks. Common people, for the most part, did not make use of banks. They just hung on to their own money, literally burying it in the backyard, putting it into mattresses, keeping it in some kind of a safe place. A lot of people wore money belts to keep it right on their body, although you always risk being robbed by somebody if you did that. So there were a lot of mistrust, a lot of misunderstanding, and common people didn't use banks very much. In the early national era, you read in US history that Alexander Hamilton had a lot to do with this, that Alexander Hamilton wrote a report to Congress once he was appointed Secretary of the Treasury, in which he recommended that a national banking law be passed, creating the first Bank of the United States. So the BUS #1, created in 1791 by an act of Congress. It lasted for 20 years, had a 20-year charter. Basically, Congress said that they would give a charter to a group of wealthy people who had a lot of knowledge and understanding and would be able to run a bank well. They created that bank. As hopefully you remember from US history, the bank provided a lot of services for the national government. It kept the government's tax receipts, were deposited into the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States provided a checking account for the federal government, and wrote checks to whoever the federal government owed money to. And it also helped to control the other banks throughout the original 13 states. It would collect the banknotes from those banks. So let me pause here and tell you what do I mean by it would collect banknotes from those banks. The Constitution only says that the federal government has the sole right to coin money. That means literally making coins out of gold, silver, and whatever other metals there were. It didn't say anything about currency. So not only could the federal government provide currency, and in the very earliest times during the Revolutionary War, the Continentals were the currency that the Continental Congress had devised to pay its soldiers and to pay its bills, theoretically backed by gold, but probably not really, because the Continental Congress didn't have stores of gold to back it with anyway. But anybody else could print currency that wanted to, as long as it was acceptable by people. Remember, money is anything that people accept. So a bank in Richmond, Virginia would create its own banknotes on the Bank of Richmond, Virginia, and those banknotes were basically the debt of the Bank of Richmond, Virginia to the people who had deposited money, and by that I mean gold and silver coins, into the Bank of Virginia. And the people found that using the ones, fives, tens, 20s of the Bank of Virginia provided to them as banknotes was fine. It was great currency to use throughout Virginia. But if you took that currency to New York or down to Georgia, it might not be accepted. You would need currency from a bank down in Georgia or in New York City. But Continentals were, once they were reestablished and Alexander Hamilton made good on the debt of the government to the revolutionary bondholders and stakeholders, the Continental money began to be used again. And that was good pretty much throughout the country. But still, people trusted their own local currencies more. So there were a lot of different, maybe 100 different currencies going on throughout the 13, eventually 16, eventually 20 states that were created early on. So that's the early period. Now, the Bank of the United States would collect these notes from those various banks because it would take them as deposits of the people, because the Bank of the United States was not only a bank for the U.S. government, it was open to all the merchants and the wealthy people of the country. So it had deposits from all around the country in its various branches, and it had a number of branches in New England, the middle states, and the southern states. So people would deposit their money in the form of banknotes from the Bank of Richmond or the Bank of Miami or the Bank of Charleston or the Bank of Hartford, Connecticut. And the Bank of the United States would take these notes every once in a while and send a courier out to, let's say, the Bank of Richmond in Virginia and say, we've got $20,000 of your banknotes. We want to turn this in because it says that it's redeemable for gold or silver specie. Specie means coins. It means gold or silver coins. So the Bank of Richmond would have to go into its vault and pull out $20,000 of gold coins or silver coins and give them to the guy because he was redeeming those notes and it said they were redeemable. If they couldn't do that, then what basically had happened is the Bank of the United States had bankrupted and shut down the Bank of Richmond. So the Bank of Richmond had to come up with this gold and silver, give it to them, and they would right away head back to the branch of the Bank of the United States they were from. And if the Bank of Richmond was able to do that and to prove that its banknotes were covered, were in fact good for real money, the gold and silver specie, then everything was fine. And in fact, what would usually happen several weeks later is the Bank of the United States, the BUS, would bring a lot of that gold and silver back, redeposit it, and take back some of those notes from the Bank of Richmond. But any bank that couldn't redeem its notes basically was driven out of business by the Bank of the United States. So the function of the Bank of the United States was not only to act as a banker for the federal government and to handle deposits of wealthy merchants and landowners, it was also to monitor the hundreds of banks that were existing throughout the new states and make sure that they had, in fact, the gold and silver in the vault that their currency represented. So it made sure all these banks were solvent. And any bank that couldn't handle that pressure went out of business, and the Bank of the United States made sure that only good, solid banks were in existence. All right. A lot of people didn't like Hamilton's Bank. You know that the Jeffersonians were all against it. They thought that it was unconstitutional in the first place. So the 20-year charter was allowed to run out in 1811. The bank disappeared. Its charter ran out. The owners of the bank broke the bank down into several smaller state-chartered banks, and we didn't have a central bank starting in 1811. Well, what happened in 1812? We got into the War of 1812. England and America went to war. And during that wartime, the central government, which was at that time run by James Madison as president, was trying to borrow money to get an army together and buy munitions to fight this war. And they were having a hard time getting the wealthy people and the banks that did exist to loan them enough money. If the Bank of the United States had still been in existence, it would have been able to lend the money to the federal government right away, right up front, and everything would have been great. They would have been able to buy what they needed to fight the war. But they couldn't. And so the War of 1812, if you recall, didn't go very well for the United States in the early going. In 1812, 1813, and even in 1814, we were losing a lot of battles to the British. The White House itself was captured and burned to the ground, if you recall. Finally, we got the upper hand. We succeeded in winning the War of 1812 and 1815. The Battle of New Orleans actually happened 2 weeks after the armistice was signed, but nonetheless we defeated the British, and we were independent and maintained our independence. And guess what they did? The next Congress in 1816 enacted the Second Bank of the United States. We didn't want to get caught with our pants down again. It existed for a period of time until Andrew Jackson became president. Andrew Jackson, like the Jeffersonians, was against this idea of central banking. He didn't understand it very well. He thought bankers were basically wealthy people ripping everybody else off. When he won re-election to the presidency in 1832, again, you remember from your U.S. history class, he took that as a mandate to destroy the Second Bank of the United States. He withdrew all of the government's deposits away from the Second Bank of the United States, and it went into history. It broke up into a number of small state chartered banks, and we had no central bank for a number of years, for the next roughly 30 years. That's called the Wildcat Banking Era. During the Wildcat Banking Era, anybody who wanted to could open a bank. Usually they were state chartered banks. Sometimes they weren't even that. They were just charlatan con artists that were setting up banks. But a lot of banks were good and solid banks too, don't get me wrong. More people began to feel the need for banks because the U.S. economy was growing fairly rapidly at that time, mostly an agricultural economy, but manufacturing was taking off also. So more small businessmen were making use of banks during that time. But the problem is these con artist banks, these wildcat banks, would start up, take people's deposits, and then several months later, after they had opened and taken a lot of deposits from people in Omaha, Nebraska, or somewhere in Iowa, would disappear into the night. This is where the term fly-by-night comes from. That means a crook, basically, a guy who takes your money and then disappears in the middle of the night. The next morning when you wake up to go do business with him, he's gone. You knock on the door, there's nobody home, and it turns out that, his horses and his carriages are all gone, and he's got a 10-hour lead on you, and you don't know which direction he headed. So a lot of people lost their money during that time period. The Wildcat Banking Era was a terrible time, and people really began to distrust banks, especially out in the west of the Mississippi. During the Civil War, the federal government of the United States, the Union government, began to feel the need for central banking again. Wartime often does that to a central government. And so the senators and congressmen got together, and instead of creating a central bank, they thought, well, let's just let the Treasury start to monitor and manage all the banks in the United States. And they created two different sets of laws. In 1863, the Banking Act of 1863, and then secondly, the Banking Act of 1864. Those series of laws created what we call the national banking era. It created nationally chartered banks, which didn't exist during the Wildcat Banking era. There were no nationally chartered banks. All banks were state chartered in whatever state they were. Now we had a dual banking system, and that's important for you to remember. To this day, we still have a dual banking system. There are national banks chartered by the federal government of the United States, like Bank of America, Union Bank, Wells Fargo, okay? And there are smaller state chartered banks, and I don't even have the name of one of them off the top of my head right now, but they're banks that just have one or two branches maybe. They're local either in, just some East County, San Diego, or up in Riverside somewhere. But there are still a number of small state chartered banks. And so that national banking era lasted from 1864 to 1913 when the Federal Reserve Act was passed. And I told you this is going to be a long video, already just under 15 minutes. So I'm going to cut it here. And the next video on this is going to pick it up from it's going to pick it up during the national banking era and tell you what the problems were that evolved during that period. It was better than the Wildcat banking. It wasn't as bad as that. but there were still major problems in our banking system during the national banking era, and that's in the next video.